when elected, I promise you we will govern on behalf of all Americans.
Vice President Kamala Harris has selected Tim Walz as her running mate.
This thing that it's so close, let's just win big, people. Let's just win big.
There's a lot of excitement, a lot of enthusiasm, and a lot of energy with Kamala Harris and Tim Walz at the top of the ticket.
Hello and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Michael Scherer, national political reporter for the Washington Post, coming to you live from my Chicago hotel room here at the Democratic National Convention. My guest today is formerly Biden, now Kamala Harris campaign chair, Jen O'Malley Dillon. Welcome, Jen. I hope you're having as good a week as it appears you are.
We're having fun. It's always a good time to be in Chicago.
That's right. Well, let's get started. Your boss has a big speech tonight. I assume you've read the speech. I assume you've talked with her about it. How is she spending this final day preparing for her big moment on the primetime stage?
Well, she does have a big speech tonight. We're so excited about the lead up from this week, and every night so far has been tremendous. But as part of what she's doing today, she's just getting ready. And you're going to hear from her, I think, very clearly the vision she has for this country. You're going to hear her talk about what's at stake in this country. You're going to hear her talk about the choice in front of the American people. And you're going to hear more about who she is, her biography and background. We know how important it is for the American people to learn more about the vice president. And you're going to hear how those stories and life, jobs and interactions and personal connections have built the framing for the leader she is, the values she shares, who she's fighting for. And you're going to see that clearly tonight with a lot of energy and a lot of excitement. So we can't wait.
One of the things I've been struck by watching the last three nights is that a lot of the speakers are casting Harris as the change candidate in this race. You talked about the choice. Obama even said the sequel is usually worse than the original, referring to Trump. Why make the case? Why is Kamala Harris, who is the incumbent vice president, more of a change for this country than Donald Trump would be?
Well, first of all, let's not forget that Donald Trump is a former president, and we are the underdogs in this race. I think, of course, this is a very unusual race in terms of the shift that we've had over the last several weeks. But I think what you've seen in the vice president is her step into the moment that we find ourselves in, and an opportunity to not only showcase the leadership she's had over the last 4 years, working closely with President Biden, but putting her own stamp on the future and being clear about what is at stake in this country, what the choice is. And this is, regardless of this race in particular, this is the time when people start paying more attention and tuning in. We've known that all along. The convention itself is an opportunity not just to speak to people in the hall, but to speak to everyone in the country. That's been a big part of what we're doing every day here. But we really see that her vision, her leadership, her and Governor Walz together, this phase of the campaign allows us to really introduce them to the American people. I think what she has been able to tap into is an energy and an excitement and a hopefulness, a joyfulness out there on the campaign trail. And I think that really is showing her new and fresh ideas she's been putting forth, whether it's policy from last week in Raleigh to the energy that she and Governor Walz bring to this. And I think young people, communities of color, parts of the what used to be the Biden coalition, the Biden-Harris coalition from 2020, she has really tapped into that and energized and excited people. And people are now saying, let me see more about this. Let me understand more of who she is. We know that the American people don't know that much about the vice president. And so we really have an opportunity to fill that in for them and to fill that in a way that really shows how she's going to make a difference in their lives. And ultimately, that's what people care about. And I think that's what you're going to hear from her tonight. That's what you've heard day after day here at the convention. We'll continue to do that as she travels across the country.
Let's talk a bit about the map. You talk about the blue wall states and the Sun Belt states. If I talk to the Trump campaign, they talk about Pennsylvania, because if they're able to win Pennsylvania, then you need to win North Carolina, Georgia, and another state to win, which is a tough inside straight to draw. Talk to me about the importance of Pennsylvania. And then I'm curious, between North Carolina and Georgia, Which state you think is closer to coming online at this point?
Well, look, first of all, our campaign is focused on getting to 270 electoral votes. Any good campaign wants to create as many different pathways to do that. You can talk about it from a blue wall pathway, you can talk about it from a Sunbelt pathway, but at the end of the day, what we have to do is ensure that we have the organization, the structure of our campaign, and our ability to reach voters and the shape of the electorate in each of these states to get to 270. Of course, Pennsylvania is critical to that, but so is Georgia and Nevada. So is what we've seen in Michigan and Wisconsin, Nebraska too. You can kind of go through each of these and you can make a different scenario work. We are obviously clear-eyed that this is going to be an extremely close race. We are we're looking at the polls. We feel very good about what we're seeing, but at the same time, this is a margin of error race. In some polls, public and otherwise, we're seeing us up ahead, us dead even, or behind in these states. And so for us, our focus is very much on how do we not only lead a national presidential campaign, but how do we ensure that we're building a campaign state by state that really reflects the demographics in the state and the issues that the American people care about. And for us, that means that we have opportunity everywhere. We're really seeing the vice president consolidating the base. We are seeing a real opportunity with expansion targets. We are seeing a much wider map, a much wider audience and coalition that can come together for the vice president and Governor Walz if we do the work. And our map is much wider than Donald Trump's. And we're very confident that we're going to continue to put these states in play.
Pick a favorite. Which one comes online first, North Carolina or Georgia?
That's like choosing your favorite child. I'm not going to do that. No, but look, seriously, I will say, North Carolina is a state that has not been a presidential battleground that Democrats have won since 2008. It is a very large, expensive state, but it is a state that has real opportunity. And it's not just demographics, it's because of leadership of Governor Cooper. It is because of the extreme that we're seeing in play in state with things like a very restrictive reproductive freedom ban. You are also seeing in the candidate on the Republican side for governor more and more extreme MAGA ideology and policies that really reflect Trump's Project 2025. And we know the more people hear about that, we know the more people understand how extreme they are, the more they don't like that. And so we see real opportunity in North Carolina. We see the same opportunity in Georgia. Georgia obviously has had more Democratic success recently than North Carolina, but both for different reasons we see to be in play. And that's why you're going to continue to see the vice president travel there. You're going to see the governor travel there. We have an extraordinary amount of surrogates that we're going to see out there. And then I'd also, argue looking at Nevada and Arizona. Arizona, obviously, a place I was bullish on in 2020. I am again. There is real opportunity for the vice president, who has always had really strong support in those states with core constituencies, Latino communities in particular, but also really reflective of her leadership and how she's been able to be in these places time and time again, not just in her official capacity, but also as part of the campaign over the course of the last year.
I saw you say a couple days ago that you were excited to do more debates after the September 10th debate. I think you were suggesting that the negotiations for a future debate would happen once and if President Trump shows up for the ABC debate. Do you have the same conditions for any future debate as you had for this first one, namely that there be a mic cut off, that there's no live studio audience, that the networks that you presented in the early summer are the networks that we choose from?
Well, first of all, I will say that the vice president has been very clear. She's excited to debate. I think that any opportunity we have for the vice president to be on stage with Donald Trump and present the choice that exists in this election and the two visions for the future, we will take. But we're also not going to negotiate anything until Donald Trump shows up on that first debate stage. And as the vice president said, she's happy to debate more. We're excited about Governor Walz and JD Vance, Senator Vance, being able to debate on October 1st. We're looking forward to that. We'll work through the details of what that looks like. But fundamentally, we believe the American people deserve to hear from both the vice president and Trump on the same stage. And we're looking forward to that. And we'll be ready.
So there's possibility we'll have a live studio audience. That's what I heard you say.
Listen,
No
I'm not here to negotiate the debate with you, Michael.
Okay, yeah, don't negotiate with me. A few weeks back, uh, uh, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who may very well be endorsing Donald Trump tomorrow, reached out through intermediaries to try and get a meeting with Vice President Harris. Did you hear about that outreach, and why was it a smart move by Vice President Harris not to take that meeting?
Well, look, first of all, I will say, we don't know for sure what's going to happen here, but we are building a party and a campaign that welcomes everyone. So if you are someone that was with RFK before, you have a home here. I think that's something that hopefully people have seen over the course of the last 4 days. You can be a Democratic Party stalwart, you could be an independent, a Republican, a never Trumper. Wherever you come from, there is a home for you here. And that's for anyone who maybe has looked at third party before, and wants to take another look and learn more about the vice president. So we know how close this race is going to be. We're going to do everything in our power to make sure that we are reaching every voter possible, and we're connecting and finding ways to do that. And that includes people that maybe had found an interest with RFK. What he ends up doing and how he does that, that's for him to decide. While this is going to be a close race, we're quite confident, regardless of whether this is a head-to-head race with Donald Trump in a state or it's a multi-candidate, that the vice president, as long as we do the work, will come out ahead.
But there's no upside for you talking to him. I mean, some of the polls right now show that his support leans more Trump just because he's lost so many of the Harris leaning voters since Harris got into the race. So it's possible if there is an endorsement, he's going to get a little bump in some of these states, and you guys are not having a conversation with him.
Well, we are having a conversation with his voters, and that's what we're focused on, right? I mean, we're not going to do anything but make sure we stay focused on the American people and making sure we reach them in ways that have a real impact. That is not just about politics or business as usual, but is about how people can see themselves and the vision that the vice president's setting out and feel that reflected in how we're moving forward. And we feel like we have a real opportunity to do that. And that's really mostly what we're focused on as we go day to day and we campaign across the country. So we welcome people to take a look here, tune in tonight, continue to talk to us, find a way to our offices in our battleground states. We know that there is a small group of people still in these states that are undecided, that haven't made up their mind, that want to know more. And that's what we're going to focus on above and beyond anything else.
When will Vice President Harris do interviews with the press? And what should us in the media take as the lesson of her not having done it over the last few weeks and still having a pretty successful campaign? Is this a sign of how campaigns will go in the future, that you guys can just ignore candidate sit downs with us?
I only chuckle a little bit because of the end of what you just said. But look, first of all, the vice president has been clear. She's going to do an interview by the end of the month, and we're going to live up to that. But let us all focus on what our goal is, which is to reach the American people and creating every opportunity possible to reach people that maybe aren't tuning into the news in the same way, certainly not in the traditional ways people have in the past, and creating opportunities for people to find their way to this campaign and to see themselves in it and to see themselves in the vision for the future that the vice president has in any way they want to engage. I think this campaign has been extraordinary at being able to find ways to reach people in their own terms and in their own ways, whether it's on the ground, on our campaign and the million voter contacts we did just last weekend alone, which is quite significant, to the social media and ways people are plugging into all the amazing surrogates and influencers and people that are standing up to support this campaign, and they're reaching out to their own networks. What you're going to see from this campaign and the vice president and Governor Walz is us doing everything possible to reach people and to reach people in a way that has real impact. And I think that means, of course, having conversations with the press. I mean, I'm here today, but also to make sure that we're doing it in lots of different ways. And you're going to continue to see her do that time and time again. You're going to see them out there doing everything in their power to earn every vote in this country by being out there and engaging with people, whether it's in large events, whether it's in smaller engagements, whether it's through the traditional press, whether it's through other mediums. We're going to keep doing that everywhere we can.
Well, we appreciate you being here today. The otherwise smooth, I think it's been frictionless for the most part, convention this week has had a little bit of suspense behind the scenes, and that is that a group of uncommitted delegates have been trying to get a Palestinian American speaker to speak at the convention. It wasn't clear whether that would happen. We got word last night that that wouldn't happen, and since then you've had Congress people like Representative Cortez, the United Auto Workers, even a family member of one of the Israeli hostages held by Hamas, come out and say that the Harris campaign should reconsider that there should be a Palestinian American speaker on the stage. So could you just answer why there is not one and whether that is being reconsidered?
Well, look, first of all, I think you've heard from the vice president herself the importance of talking about this critical issue that impacts so many. She is focused every day as vice president, working alongside President Biden to do everything in their power to create a permanent ceasefire, to bring the hostages home, and to add to humanitarian aid in Gaza. So she is laser focused on that. She has had the opportunity to meet with members and leaders of the uncommitted delegates when she was in Michigan just a few days ago. We have had a lot of opportunity over the course of this week in different ways for people to plug in and engage. There's been a number of panels that the uncommitted delegates have been part of. But obviously, this is a tough issue and an important one, and one that you've heard from the debates. I keep doing that from the convention stage this week. But we're going to continue to make sure that there is a way to have dialogue as we move forward. The vice president has been very public about this, and we continue to focus on making sure everyone has a home in this party and an opportunity to have a conversation.
Should those activists expect that Vice President Harris will announce her own policy, as she has on economic policies and other things recently, about the Israeli Hamas situation before the campaign? Is that something that you guys are planning and thinking about?
Well, look, I think the vice president has been very vocal and very clear throughout this administration and since last October where she stands on this and the work she's doing day in and day out to bring together sides to ensure that we move forward with a permanent ceasefire. And as I said, to bring home the hostages and to continue to create an opportunity for more humanitarian aid and protecting civilians in Gaza. So you have heard her speak to this. She's going to continue to do that. She's going to continue to do that from her position as the vice president. She's going to continue to do that. She crosses the country and has these conversations.
Uh, one of the things that struck me also the last few weeks is that Trump is running against 2019 Kamala Harris. I mean, he has ads up with the positions she mentioned during the Democratic primaries in 2019. So I was wondering if I could just run through some of these positions that she took back then, and you tell me whether she still holds them. Does she still want to ban fracking?
I think we've already been public on our position on fracking in this campaign. And look, I look before you go through the litany
Yeah.
of questions. Let me just say we are in 2024, and we have come through in partnership, the president and the vice president, a very extraordinary time of COVID and leading with conflict around the world. And I think you have seen their leadership together day in and day out over the last several years, and really tackling very tough issues, domestic and international. And so I think when the vice president stepped into this moment, this extraordinary moment to lead this ticket, you saw from her very clearly the vision that she has for this country, the choice that's at stake. It is steeped in the values and the leadership she's had over the course of the last 4 years on issues she's been leading on, from reproductive freedom, from contraception to IVF to abortion to as she spent the last year traveling with leading on economic summits, reaching communities of color. You saw her first policy announcements just last week in Raleigh, where she talks about who she's fighting for by really also telling a little bit more about her story, the story about her mom. And the pride she had when she saved for such a long time to be able to afford housing, and how much that meant to her to buy a home, and the policy that the vice president put forth really focused on bringing down costs for everyday Americans and understanding that there's more we have to do to make life more affordable. And I think what you're going to continue to hear her talk about and focus on is the future. Donald Trump wants to focus on the past. We know that. But the American people want someone that understands what it's like to go through what they're going through, that understands what it's like to be part of the middle class, and to have a government and a leadership that wants to do something about that. And so we're not going to get distracted by what direction Donald Trump wants to take this campaign and his campaign, since he does not have the type of vision for the future that the American people want. His is extreme. It is about repealing the ACA. It is about a national abortion ban. It is about tariffs that are essentially a tax cut on the middle class. his Project 2025, the more people know about it, the more they dislike it. And that, in contrast to the vice president's vision, is how we're going to continue to run this campaign and focus on how we communicate to the American people.
Yeah, and politicians change their position on policy all the time. So she's not for the fracking ban, but Medicare for all, she's not advocating that right now. Mandatory gun buyback, she's not advocating. The Green New Deal, because you've had the Inflation Reduction Act. Is she not still advocating? And can you just run through those three? I mean, are those things that are part of her agenda if she wins the presidency?
Well, look, you've seen her leadership over the last 4 years and the key elements on climate, on healthcare, on leadership across every aspect of what they have put forth from an administration and partnership. And you're hearing her talk about that everywhere she is. I mean, she is now at the top of the ticket, and she has an opportunity to define who she is and her leadership, but it's also steeped in the work of this historic administration. But at its core, at the root of who the vice president is about actual people and everyday people in their lives and having an impact. So that's why you're going to hear her talk about the work that's still ahead. You're going to have her continue to talk about and lead on issues that we know the American people care about, like reproductive freedom, that she has been the leader on since Dobbs. We know that there are people that are new to the fold, new voters, people that did not vote for us in 2020, but because of what happened with Dobbs, they're here with us now and they're open to us. That has really created a broader group of folks that we can reach out to. So you're going to continue to see her build on the accomplishments of this administration, but put her own stamp on the future and frame that on delivering for the American people.
Okay, we'll stay tuned for an answer to those questions. Let me end with something that is an easier question to answer. You at the beginning of this campaign put a pretty big investment in relational organizing, and that's basically getting volunteers to use their smartphones to connect with friends and family, to tell them things about registering to vote or getting out to vote or volunteering or giving money. You invested heavily in an app that you've gotten people to download. Could you just give us an update since Harris took over as the nominee from Biden about how well that is working and how it's working compared to what your expectations were, I don't know, 6, 8, 10 months ago, 2 years ago when you started coming up with this plan?
Yeah, well, you know how much I love talking about this, so thank you
I do.
to
That's
bring
my
it up.
ending with this.
Yeah, hey, I like that. I like that.
Yeah.
But look, we believe as a campaign and as a way to reach people, you have to reach people in the ways that they engage in their own lives. And so many people, certainly post Donald Trump, really tried to tune out to politics and not really want to engage in the same ways we had seen traditional organizing work. That does not mean to say that we aren't out there knocking on doors and making calls and texting and all the rest. We are going to do that day in and day out. I think I mentioned 1 million direct voter contacts this past weekend alone. But we also are creating ways for people to plug in the ways that they exist in their own lives. Campaigns are about people. So how do you reach people? How do you reach people that maybe are not watching traditional news? How do you reach people and do that in a way that has the maximum impact? And the way we believe you do that is by trusted sources and relationships in people's lives, and in a way that allows people to plug in that is much more natural to them. So whether that is through an app that we work through, or it's your own group text chain, or it's because you find a way to come together on a different issue or on something social and you're able to talk about the campaign as part of that. Our goal, our responsibility as a campaign is to make it easy for you to see yourself in the campaign and to take action, to be inspired to take action, to be empowered to take action, but to do it in a way that you can do it in your own life and in a way that really makes sense for you. And so we've really created so many different opportunities for people to do that. If you want to come into our office, we've got a home for you. If you never want to see another person in person and you want to stay home and connect over platforms that you and your friends connect with, we have a home for you. If you want to take action and just text people you know, or share memes or create content, we have a home for you. And we have a way that not only can you be empowered, but you can reach and have an impact on other people. And so we continue to build on those ideas, but they're really kind of fundamental to how people interact in their lives. And what I will say is, over the course of the last several weeks, we have just seen an extraordinary amount of people across this country in battleground states and everywhere, every corner of the country, show up and participate in different ways, whether it's going to our events. Of course, crowd size does not make the difference of winning or losing, but we continue to see energy in whatever we're doing, and we're going to continue to find ways to make sure that people are plugging in and being able to reach other voters and give them a home with us.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Jen O'Malley Dillon, campaign chair for Vice President Kamala Harris. Good luck with the next, whatever, 80 days, 70 days? I'm not even sure at this point.
75, but who's counting?
75 days. And that's all the time we have here at Washington Post Live. For more information, to subscribe, to find out about more events, WashingtonPost.com/live. I'm Michael Scherer. See you next time.